Hey, it's Zane here and welcome back. So we've had a cyclone here the last couple of days in southeast Queensland. Thankfully things have settled a little now. A lot of trees and stuff behind me that have kind of fallen and in the area where I live. But I thought I'd just get out and have a little drive just to check out what's going on around the place. But also wanted to share some thoughts with you regarding the announcement over the past couple of days that the US is now setting up a strategic Bitcoin reserve. So by executive order, President Trump made the announcement together with David Sachs just about 48 hours ago that the US will now be officially setting up a strategic Bitcoin reserve. And so I think that this was always going to happen, but I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are on this and what it means for Bitcoin moving forward as an asset class. And, for me, it really represents a defining crossroads, solidifying moment in Bitcoin's history, because what you have now is the world's most significant economic superpower that has now announced to the world that it is going to be stockpiling Bitcoin as an asset. It is going to be putting Bitcoin into reserve as a value system, as a store of value for the government treasury. And I think that sends a message to the rest of the world that if they want to, really be a strong force into the future, they need to be thinking about their own strategic reserves when it comes to this asset, which we know is the hardest form of money that humanity has ever seen. The world's first fixed, finite, absolutely scarce digital monetary technology, and it is an idea whose time has come. And so I think at a country level, nation states, we're seeing different states within the US that are also setting up their own strategic Bitcoin reserves at a state level. We've seen what's happened in El Salvador since 2021. President Bukele, who's basically given the middle finger to the IMF because as an emerging or third world nation, these countries that have these forward-thinking leaders, they realise that over the years being at the whim of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, has not been good for their country. And there's a whole story around that and the corruption of that system and the way that it impoverishes these nations. But Bukele, he basically decided that no more for El Salvador. They were sick of having the highest homicide rates in the world per capita, no progression, crime everywhere, although they had, great natural resources. And so he came in, he cleaned the place up, got rid of all the crime, started buying Bitcoin, and essentially are no longer indebted to the IMF. And then the IMF comes out in the last week and says that, they're not happy with what El Salvador is doing, and they basically want them to stop buying Bitcoin. But El Salvador, Bukele, he understood what was going on, and so he decided that the only way forward for his country, if they were to be sovereign and not to be held to ransom by the IMF, was to actually set up this Bitcoin strategic reserve. And so I believe that other countries around the world are going to really start to take notice now that it's not just a little country like El Salvador who is transforming itself due to this, but the biggest economic superpower on earth has also decided to do the same. Now, the US has said in this announcement regarding the strategic reserve that they will not have taxpayers on the hook for the acquisition of any more Bitcoin. So essentially this means that, this school of thought that was out there that suggested that, the US was going to acquire 150 to 200,000 Bitcoin over the next 5 years so that they could get themselves to 1 million Bitcoin in their strategic reserve. The question around that was, how are they going to be able to afford it? Where's the money going to come from to acquire that Bitcoin? And, some people were saying, well, it's quite simple. They'll just print the money, because he who owns the money printer essentially controls the world, and so they could just print the money. The problem is the US dollar right now is still the reserve currency of the world, and what President Trump does not want is, he doesn't want all confidence in the US dollar to be lost. And so not only would printing all this these billions and trillions of dollars to acquire this Bitcoin over the next 5 years create enormous inflation, but it would also create enormous distrust in the US dollar. And so people around the world and countries around the world would lose complete faith in the US dollar. And so, my belief is that what they've decided to do instead is to stack away the 200,000 Bitcoin that they've already got in reserve. And now the next question is going to be how they're going to actually add to that strategic reserve over time. And the reason the US wants to do this is, A, it can see that that Bitcoin represents digital scarcity. So in other words, because it is the most scarce form of digital property that exists, they know that over time the value of that Bitcoin, that 200,000 Bitcoin they have in reserve, which they've declared that they will never be selling, the value of that is going to only go up over time. Now, when you have a national debt to the tune of $37 trillion, as the US has, they know that they're never going to be able to pay that debt through raising taxes from the people. And so they have to think of other ways that they can get the country out of debt. And, for as long as the only method to do that is through printing money, the debt will never go away, because essentially you're just throwing fuel on the fire. You're just creating more debt to pay off the interest of the existing debt, which essentially is just inflating the balloon. And this is essentially what has happened since 1971, since we've had a currency with no checks and balances. And the granddaddy of all of this has, of course, been the US. And so, but the same effects have been in Australia and other countries around the world, whereby our currencies have also been inflated into oblivion, because our currencies don't have any checks and balances and aren't backed by anything either. And so all of this ties back into this US strategic Bitcoin reserve. And I believe that the US is sending a loud signal to the rest of the developed world, and not just the developed world, but even emerging countries and impoverished third world nations as well. If you want to get yourself on the map, if you want to get yourself out of debt, if you want to create a future for your country, you need to hold the best assets in reserve. And the number one asset to hold is Bitcoin, because it is the most scarce and the most fixed and the most finite. And so this is what they're doing. Now, there is a big question as to how they're going to acquire more Bitcoin if taxpayers aren't going to fund it, and if they're not going to create more inflation in order to acquire more Bitcoin. So they're not going to print money, and they're not going to raise taxes on the people in order to acquire more Bitcoin. So the next question becomes, so how are they going to do it? Now, if you've been paying attention over the last few weeks to the decentralized alternative media space, particularly on YouTube and social media, you will have heard about Fort Knox and all of the question marks that exist around whether or not the US actually has the amount of gold that they think they do in Fort Knox in Kentucky. And, apparently the place hasn't been audited since 1972 or 1973, but even that wasn't really considered an audit. It was kind of a quick show and tell just for the cameras, and only a select couple of people got to actually step inside Fort Knox, showed a few bars of gold, a few happy snaps were taken, and so it wasn't really a real audit that was conducted. And the way that Fort Knox was set up, and how the gold all got there, the way the place was built, the whole thing is shrouded in so much secrecy that the people don't actually know what is there. And so much so that President Trump, together with Elon Musk, have basically declared to the American people that they're going to audit Fort Knox. They want to go down to Fort Knox and check out what's there, and they want to actually be able to announce to the American people what they have in gold reserves. And so the problem with all of this, and this is one of the inherent issues with gold, is that you can't verify it. It's not easy to verify. And so, if I give you a piece of gold, it's not easy for you to know yourself if the piece of gold that I've given you, the bar of gold, is actually real gold. And, because you haven't verified it, you need certain testing mechanisms to actually know that the bar of gold that I've given you is in fact legitimate, real gold. And so, we're only really taking the other party's word for it unless we get it verified. And in the same way, the American people, they're really taking the word of the government, and have been up until this point. And even if they trust President Trump implicitly and Elon Musk and their crew, who are going to apparently audit Fort Knox, they're still relying on their word that what they say is there is actually there. In other words, the people can't actually verify it. There's no way of doing that. And so this is, the problem that Bitcoin solves, because with Bitcoin, because it is a decentralized, immutable blockchain ledger that can't be stuffed with, and every transaction is verified by thousands of computer nodes around the world that all essentially authenticate and verify each address and each transaction, it's very easy to actually verify that the Bitcoin belongs to a certain address, so belongs to a certain party, and that it is actually there. And so, I believe that the US is doing this because it knows that this is the way forward. We are moving into the digital age. There are lots of inherent problems with gold. The BRICS nations, who are basically trying to sever themselves from the US, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, they are very much rich in gold. And, Michael Saylor has come out and he has said, well, one of the ways to actually acquire more Bitcoin is if the US actually sold whatever gold, or a portion of the gold that it has in reserve at Fort Knox. And, he says that the impact of this would basically escalate America immediately to an absolute dominant superpower beyond the level that it currently is. But it would also send the BRICS nations, send a very clear message to the BRICS nations, because if the US starts dumping gold in order to acquire Bitcoin, what's that going to do to the value of gold? And so all of these BRICS nations that are very rich in gold and have been hoarding gold, essentially they'll be left holding the bag, is kind of the perspective that Saylor has on this. Now, I'm not an expert in this area, but it does seem to me that if the US comes out and makes any kind of announcement that is a legitimate announcement to the rest of the world about something that it is doing, then that announcement is going to have an effect economically around the world. And so if the US comes out and it says that we are now selling down our reserves of gold at Fort Knox in order to acquire more Bitcoin, that's not going to cost the taxpayers any money. And it's also going to essentially put the BRICS nations in their place to a degree, because the world's number one economic superpower is now selling their gold for Bitcoin, and then it's just going to make Bitcoin even more valuable because it is it is finite, and so the demand for Bitcoin, one would think, is only going to go up all around the world. And so this is a really interesting take on this, and there are people a lot smarter than me who are really spending a lot of time down this rabbit hole, trying to establish what this all could mean. But I think for you and I, what it essentially means in simple terms is that the value of Bitcoin is only going to escalate from here, because it is now a legitimate global asset. The biggest economic force in history has now declared that it is putting Bitcoin in reserve as a strategic asset. The intention is for them to acquire more Bitcoin, but the only way that anybody can see that they can do that is to actually divest some of their gold holdings. This is going to have big implications around the world. And for anybody who holds Bitcoin, I think that the value of our holdings is only going to become more and more significant with all of these tailwinds, they're sitting there right now. And so, it's a great time to be in Bitcoin. It's a great time to be acquiring Bitcoin. It's not going anywhere. Bitcoin is like granite. It is a base layer asset that so many different financial products are going to be built upon over the coming years. It's really like buying a piece of the internet. The internet protocol, the HTTPS protocol. Imagine if you could have bought a piece of that, and then every transaction on Amazon, every email that was downloaded, every streaming video or show on Netflix or Stan, every time something like that, every time there was any activity on the internet protocol, you got paid a piece of it. That's what it's like to own base layer Bitcoin. And so this is all now, I believe, at a really, really interesting time. And, the US making this announcement really does verify that Bitcoin is here to stay. It cannot be stopped. Everyone's going to need it. And right now it is still an asset that still very few people understand. And so I'm going to leave it there today, but really fascinating times. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you like this video, please give it a like, share, subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. This is Zane signing out. Bye for now.